Okay, folks, we're gonna get started with our wonderful class. I apologize, my personal camera is actually not working at the moment, so I do apologize for that. But we have the wonderful Rabbi Devin Maimon Villareal here for the third and final class in our three-part series of Sephardic rights versus responsibilities, insights from Sephardic sages, and balancing individual rights and communal responsibilities in some of the hot topics we've been dealing with in the 21st century. As a reminder to everyone, this class is done through our wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy. We have a host of other programs as well. If you haven't checked them out, I encourage you to do so on our website, sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. One other note I'll make regarding the Sephardic Digital Academy is that it is a non-profit initiative, meaning that we do rely on your support. If you're able to, and only if you're able to, we know it's a difficult time for many people right now, to donate, please consider making a donation. We always support it, and we always appreciate it to our nonprofit initiative. You can go to the website, sephardicbrother.com, donate to the website. We always appreciate it. Tonight, we have Rabbi Maimon Villareal, who is a dear, dear friend, a proud member of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, and is a leading education consultant for a number of institutions, including the Sephardic Adventure Camp, the Sephardic Educational Center, and recently was just appointed to the faculty at Hadar, I believe, if that's that right, Rabbi. So Mazal Tov on that new position to him as well. But without further ado, I will hand over the floor to the Rabbi. Rabbi, whenever you're ready, bechavod.
Thanks very much, Ethan, and thanks very much to the Hermandad Sephardi. Just for, I am in awe of the wonderful programming that is offered by the Sephardic Brotherhood, and I feel very honored, as always, to get the chance to participate and be a part of it. So thanks very much, Ethan, for this opportunity. And thank you very much all who are here. I think all of you have been to all three sessions, so like that really says a lot. So I appreciate your you're really being in for the long game. And before we get into this session's content, which I'm really excited about, we're going to really be moving into the philosophical realm to wrap up this series with really some just, as I was rereading the sources to prepare, just really astonishingly beautiful sources, which I think people will really enjoy. Before we get into that, though, I do just want to offer, as I have done in the past, just if people want to share a dedication for our learning together, whether it is something positive, a celebration, or something in memory of, or perhaps a request for health for someone, whatever it may be, something significant, I just want to give us a few moments to put into the chat anything you would like to dedicate our learning to this evening. Okay, and if anybody thinks of anything as we go through the class, they should feel free to enter into the chat at any time. I also just want to apologize for my voice. I managed to pick up a cold from my kids after they all had it themselves, and so I'm a little hoarse, but I think it should be okay. Also, just want to notice in the chat to my 85-year-old mother, says Loretta Odette Sarfati Levi, who gave me my Sephardic heritage and identity. Wow, that's really beautiful. And Rufwa Shlema, saludosos for Sarah Bat Esmeralda and Elia Mir Hajis. So we'll have all of that, sort of hold that together as a community and dedicate our learning to all those this evening. What we've been looking at primarily in the last few sessions was how Sephardic Chachamim really dealt with this issue of communal responsibility and individual rights through the mechanism of halakha, through their teshuvot, and looking at the factors that come into play about, what really dictates what a person ought to do, how much power, right, does the community have to put limits on a person, and is there a limit to that power of the community? And we've sort of looked at that grappling back and forth, and we've really seen, people land in different places, but we've also landed on these beautiful insights. In the first session, we talked about how one of the things that the Sephardic Chachamim do in looking at individual rights and communal responsibility is talk about how to approach each one in a way that actually is mutually supportive to the other. Right? We saw that in that first session. And then in the second session, we talked about how there seems to be a starting place of communal responsibility, at least in the literature that we looked at. But then seeing that communal responsibility nevertheless does have boundaries put on it by individual rights, right? And we saw that particularly in the case by looking at sort of certain notion of inalienable rights that individuals have, and the communal responsibility is really quite powerful, but is also kind of kept in balance by not overriding an individual's rights. And today we're going to look at sort of what undergirds all of that, right? What is the philosophical understanding of humanity, of the world, of God, right? In a way that informs then those halachic discussions. So we're really going to kind of get to the foundation of it. And we're going to actually start off by looking at some trends in larger philosophy. We're going to be taking a look at a presentation of two great Western philosophers. One is Immanuel Kant, and the second is Alasdair MacIntyre, who actually really is just sort of like a rehashing of Aristotle. And what we're going to find out is that these really remarkable trends in world philosophy are actually reflected in the discussions Sephardic Chachamim were having as well. And we have this great treasure of thinkers that we're talking about in ways just as sophisticated and penetrating. They were talking about these issues at the same level as people sort of very famous on the world philosophical stage, like Immanuel Kant and Alasdair MacIntyre. So let's kind of get ourselves oriented. Then I'm going to show this video from Professor Michael Sandel, who's a philosophy professor at Harvard, and is actually somebody who is himself committed to text study. He's a Jewish person and is known for his commitment, actually, I think on a yearly basis. He goes to the Hartman Institute in Israel. But he gives over sort of like a brief synopsis of these major philosophies, which again are really centered around whether or not our starting points, right, of really understanding who we are, does it come from an individual level, right, and our sense of individual rights and responsibilities as dictated by the individual, or does it come from a much more communal place, or what he refers to as a narrative place? And from there, we're actually going to look again at how the Chachamim of the Sephardic communities in the early modern period were actually having versions of this conversation as well. So I'm going to share my screen for a bit so we can watch this video. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pause it in the middle just to kind of like take some reactions from people. And so just kind of be on the lookout for that pause so we can get a couple of responses.
And underlying these differences are two different accounts of what it means to be a free person. For Aristotle, we're free insofar as we have the capacity to realize our potential. And that leads us to the question of fit. Fit between persons and the roles that are appropriate to them. Figuring out what I'm cut out for. That's what it means to lead a free life, to live up to my potential. Kant rejects that idea and instead substitutes his famously demanding notion of freedom as the capacity to act autonomously. Freedom means acting according to a law I give myself. Freedom as autonomy. Part of the appeal, part of the moral force of the view of Kant and of Rawls consists in the conception of the person as a free and independent self, capable of choosing his or her own ends. The image of the self is free and independent.
Okay, so Immanuel Kant's definition of freedom is the ability to act by a law that I give myself, right? So let's just pause here, and I'm just curious if people can respond in the chat, or they're welcome to unmute themselves as well. But just hearing that, does that sound like something that is a Jewish idea or not a Jewish idea? Okay, so we said one is certainly Jewish, right? So again, this Kant's idea that to act according to a law that I give myself, right, is the definition of freedom. Does that feel like a Jewish idea to people? Okay, so I've got certainly Jewish free will. Okay, great.
I think the opposite, since so much of our focus is halakha. I mean, yes, there's free will within that, but I think that there are other understandings of freedom in Judaism.
And so thank you for bringing that up, that when we look at the notion of halakha, right, that would seem to indicate a limiting, right, of individual's freedom by a larger body, right, by Jewish law that is binding upon an individual. And so that kind of is in tension, right? We have this idea of free will, right? On the other hand, there is this expectation, though, actually, that our actions will be, to some degree, right, dictated in a maximal sense and perhaps a more minimal sense, guided by, right, halakha. Right, so this is a great tension that people are bringing up. So we're going to go to the next one now, and we're going to switch over to this more communal definition, and I'm going to ask the same question. So please be listening to this next presentation, and then we'll ask the same question. Does that sound like a Jewish idea or not? Thank you, everybody, for your contributions so far.
Offers, if you think about it, a powerful, liberating vision, because what it says is that as free moral persons, we are not bound by any ties of history or of tradition or of inherited status that we haven't chosen for ourselves. And so we're unbound by any moral ties prior to our choosing them. And that means that we are free and independent, sovereign selves. We're the authors of the only obligations that constrain us. The communitarian critics.
So this is now the second perspective offered.
Of Kantian and Rawlsian liberalism acknowledge that there is something powerful and inspiring in that account of freedom, the free, independent choosing self. But they argue it misses something. It misses a whole dimension of moral life and even political life. It can't make sense of our moral experience because it can't account for certain moral and political obligations that we commonly recognize and even prize. And these include obligations of membership, loyalty, solidarity, and other moral ties that may claim us for reasons that we can't trace to an act of consent. Alistair MacIntyre gives an account, what he calls a narrative conception of the self. It's a different account of the self. Human beings are essentially storytelling creatures, MacIntyre argues. That means I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part?
Okay, so in this one, right, just to contrast it, the first one with Immanuel Kant was this sovereign self, right? I only live by a law which I give to myself. And in this second presentation, it's a narrative self. I can only answer what law do I have to abide by, what law am I obligated to, by answering the question of what stories, what larger stories am I a part of, which invariably, it has to include a communal dimension. I can't really define myself in isolation. I have to define myself very much in part by the stories that I am a part of. And therefore, that is also where my obligations arise from. My obligations arise from the stories, and you can read into that as well, the communities in which I participate. So does that feel like a Jewish idea to people?
Of course. I mean, our society, all of the Jewish world is essentially a communal society, right? Judaism doesn't live in a vacuum, or there's a sense of individual self, but ultimately we're meant, and our laws are designed to really function in a communal setting.
Beautifully said. Right, so much of our existence, right, is in this communal context, right? So that feels like, you know, very much a Jewish idea. Great. And then there's a very emphatic yes in the chat. Elisa, did you want to say more about that? And you can say no, by the way, that's fine.
Yeah, not particularly.
Okay, great. Yeah.
The speaker, is he an atheist? Like, there's no reference to religion or anything.
Yeah, so it's because he's presenting philosophers. So he's really sort of presenting their thought. He's not really presenting his own. So that's a very good clarifying question. Yeah, he's not really getting into any sort of his own beliefs about things. This is a lecture that he gave about these big thinkers.
Yeah, because it sounds like he's been influenced by nothing. It's just whatever we think at the moment, that's what it is, and that's what we have to decide by. But I'm sure he was influenced by his parents, by society, by religion, something.
Yeah.
But I don't get a drift of that in the speech he's making.
Yeah. So again, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, he's really not reflecting his own beliefs, but really talking about these thinkers and trying to convey their perspectives. And this other point that you brought up, I think, is very much what this second piece is about, which is we are influenced, right, by so much. We're influenced by our communal context and our histories and our parents and our families. And so that has to play into our sense of moral obligation. So thank you for raising that.
May I?
Yes, of course, please.
This is Loretta speaking. On the second one, under the communal, he talked about the liberalism, and the three words that I wrote down were membership, obligation, and loyalties, which all three of that ties in with Judaism. It's like you're a member from the day you're born into the Jewish into the Jewish tribe or whatever. And then
Yes.
you're given obligations from your bar mitzvah or whatever. And of course, your loyalties to the people and to Israel. It just, it sounds very Jewish to me.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting those three things. And, it's what's fascinating to me, right, is that I love the way that we can talk about this in a Jewish context in a unique way, because in a university context, right, in the world of Western thought, right, these are ways of thinking that clash, right, with one another, right? This idea of the sovereign self and this idea of the narrative self, right? This sort of focus on self as author of moral obligations versus the idea of the larger story as the author of obligations. Whereas we can talk about it here in a Jewish context and say, which one is it? And we can say yes, right? We can actually see how Judaism picks up on both of these threads. And that's actually what we're gonna sort of drill down into today. So thank you guys very much for sort of articulating that, I think in a really sort of perfect example. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start to look at, I just gotta close this window, just give me one moment. Look at some examples where we see Sephardic Chachamim really express these types of philosophies in their particular environment in a very Jewish way. It's going to take a Kantian idea, and as somebody made reference to, right, when the lecture we just saw, there's no reference to God, right? There's no reference to religion. There's no sort of that type of thing. But what's really fascinating, actually, is we're going to see a Jewish thinker express it in a very religious way, actually, using religious language, both about the sovereign self, right, and then as the narrative self as well. So thank you very much, Ethan, for sharing screen. And if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, please, to session 3, which I believe is going to be on page 12. Actually, no, it looks like page 11. And this is going to be from Eliezer Papo, this first one that we read. Great, thanks, Ethan. So it's just a little bit before that. Yeah, that's the one right there. And to give people just a little bit of background on Eliezer Papo, he lived in the 18th and 19th century in the Northern Balkans. I say the Northern Balkans because it is now what is Bulgaria, former Yugoslavia, and so there's a lot of sort of the nation states that became that place. He sort of operated in all of them, including Romania. And he's a fascinating thinker overall. He's somebody that his ethical works are very, very well known, but his philosophical dimensions are not often explored, which is really an area that would be we would all benefit from delving into a bit more, because he really is quite a sophisticated thinker. So I'm going to just share with you a little bit about his background, just so people can get a sense about who he was. So Rabbi Eliezer Papo, I'm just pulling up my notes real quickly. Okay, so he was the son of Chacham Yitzchak Papo. He's also referred to as the Pele Yoetz, which was his major work on ethics, widely known in the Jewish world. He was born in Sarajevo in the 18th century. He was one of the most erudite scholars that has emerged from the Sephardic world. He served as rabbi in the rabbinical court of Silestra, Bulgaria. And he, there's a lot we could say about him, but sort of, I think one of the most telling things about him is the following anecdote. In his time when he served in Silestra, Bulgaria, there is a famous incident that happened where one of the members of the community had been kidnapped and was actually sentenced to death by the secular government of the time, as often happened to Jews in that period of time, wrongfully so. This person was convicted. But the secular government did offer a ransom, but the community did not want to pay it because it was a rather exorbitant sum. And so what happened was Chacham Papo ordered that everybody to come together in the Beit Knesset. And when he had them there, the entire community, he announced that he needed them to sell all of the Sifrei Torah and all of the sacramental objects in the Beit Knesset, because he told them, he said, I don't have the ability to tell you to pay this person's ransom, but as the Chacham of the community, I can tell you to sell the Sifrei Torah. I can tell you to sell all of the Klei Kodesh, all of the sacramental objects here. He said, because at the end of the day, the Torah exists for the people of Israel. And if there's no Israel, then of what purpose is the Torah? And his speech was so effective, actually, that the community said, no, of course, we're not going to allow you to like sell the Sifrei Torah, we'll pay the ransom. So really fascinating, not just a great Chacham, but also somebody who knew how to navigate challenging situations. So let's take a look at what he has to say. This is about his position about really the sovereign self, and we're going to see him come down very clearly on that side. So this is from his work Pele Yoetz, and it reads as follows: Behold, insignificant as I am, I have found a way to exempt the whole world from harsh punishment based on the principle established in the Talmud, one who believes something is permitted is considered under duress, right? In Hebrew, ha'omer mutar anusku, right? If you in your mind believe something is permitted and you do that thing, it's halakha treats you as if you acted under duress, meaning that you are not, you're not held liable. He says, given that principle, right? He says, every person's path is right in their own eyes, right? And by the way, he's living shortly after Kant. And so I really believe that sort of like he was aware of these intellectual trends. Since everyone's path is right in their own eyes, the result is that everyone is considered one who believes something is permitted, and therefore under duress, which thereby exempts them from judgment. And this is where he adds a really fascinating lens. Number one, it's already slightly different from Kant because he's doing this based on a Talmudic halachic principle, but also really a really striking moral and ethical point that he's going to now say this is all conditional on. He says, however, this claim only works for someone who judges others favorably, using this same reasoning, right? In other words, like if I do what I think is right to the best of my abilities, and other people do the same, so I should judge them favorably. So that's the only way that this really works. If a person thinks in that way, is not overly critical about things, and instead lets go of affronts against him. Only then will his offenses also be let go. This is just like the teaching of our sages from the Talmud and Masechet Megillah. The measure by which a person judges others will also be used to measure him. And if he judges them harshly, that is how he must be judged. While anyone who judges favorably is judged favorably by the omnipresent, right? So just if I can get some reactions, people can unmute and they can also put into the chat. Is anything about this surprising, right? You can just start with that. Like, were you surprised or not surprised? And again, you can type that in the chat. You can unmute however you like. But surprised, not surprised. Okay, any reactions? And then people have had the time to think about it. Is this surprising to anybody? Not surprising to anybody?
I think just the fact that he told the kahal to sell everything. That's extraordinary. To me, I mean, it's wild.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty intense. Actually, I should have included it in this list of sources. Actually, everybody has access to this document, this Google Doc, and so I will add it. Actually, I'll either do that tonight or tomorrow morning. But it's worth seeing, sort of like the full description. It was given by his student Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, who himself was very important. Who actually was sort of a proto-Zionist and had the idea of a World Zionist Congress well before Theodor Herzl. Was a student of Rabbi Papo, and he's the one that actually records this story.
But
really,
it's very.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one other thing I would say that it is very interesting. I don't think we would see this kind of reaction, honestly, in the Ashkenazic world. I mean, Chacham, you can speak more to this in the sense of the priority of. Well, that's not necessarily true. I shouldn't speak so broadly, but I would just say that it seems particularly a Sephardic philosophy in terms of the willingness to sacrifice even the most critical of elements of Jewish faith, at least the physical elements, for the sake of a human being. I mean, I think that's a piece of volumes about Judaism.
I do, and I think that you find examples of that, across the Jewish world. I think that in Sephardic communities, it has been held onto as a guiding principle in a much more consistent way. Whereas there's nothing unusual about that, right? in a Sephardic context. It really is a guiding principle consistently. Whereas in the Ashkenazic world, just based on my experience, what I've seen in the writings is that there's more of a sort of like back and forth. You do see some rabbis that would certainly take that approach and others that would not, and would sort of stand on the sanctity of the ritual items. I think you see a more of a back and forth, whereas I think in Sephardic Judaism, this is like very much more typical. This is like, something that is almost like you'd say a universal approach. And so what I want us to just appreciate about Chacham Papo's approach here is that, again, it's actually very Kantian, right? It is that I am the author, right, of my obligations. But what's really fascinating about this is that he incorporates that into this understanding of, but God still judges you, right? It's you have a responsibility and you bear the weight of those decisions that you make on a much grander scale. This is something that Immanuel Kant would not have said. So it's still very much a sovereign self idea. But in a Jewish context, as we see expressed here by Papo, two really unique things happen that I think are beautiful. One is know that you're accountable still to a greater authority than yourself, right? We see that here. And then secondly, it is a platform to also treat others in a way that is favorable, right? To look upon others with a sense of empathy and a sense of favorable disposition. So it's really quite a powerful thing that he does here. But we very clearly see, he takes it right out of the Talmud, right? One who believes something is permitted is considered under duress, and everybody acts by what is right in their own eyes, and therefore they fall under that principle, provided that they extend it to others, right? And also know that they're ultimately accountable to God. So again, really fascinating articulation of a Kantian idea, or at least expressed famously by Kant, right, in a very Jewish way. Okay, so we're going to go on now to the second source, and this is going to be from Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, another very, very famous Sephardic sage, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi of both pre-state and the modern state of Israel. And I'm going to read just a little bit about his biography so people can get a further sense of him. So he was born in Yerushalayim to a distinguished rabbinic family in 1880. His father hired private tutors to complement his son's yeshiva studies with language, grammar, and literature. Chacham Meir Ben Zion Chai Uziel lost his father during his youth, but had the opportunity to appreciate his father's devotion to the needs of the public. So it's already going to give you a lot, right? Seeing his father's example. In the year 1900, at the age of 20, he began to serve as rabbi in Yerushalayim's Yeshiva Gedolah and established the Jerusalem Orphan School for the Sephardic community. He also established a yeshiva to train young Sephardim for the rabbinate. By the way, a good friend of La Hermandad, right, of the Sephardic Brotherhood, Rabbi Daniel Buskila, has a yeshiva there in Yerushalayim that is called Sha'arei Uziel, right, in honor of Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel. But some other important things to note about him is that in 1911, he was elected chief rabbi of the community of Yafo. In 1921, he was asked to serve in the Salonika community, which numbered 70,000 at the time. He remained there for 2 years' time, and upon his return to Israel, was chosen to fill the position of chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo. And in 1939, he was elected Rishon LeZion and moved to Yerushalayim. In addition to his rabbinic activity, Chacham Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel was a member of the National Committee, participated in the establishment of the Jewish Agency, and was the Yishuv's representative for the British regime, as well as a delegate to the Zionist Congress. He was party to all public affairs in Israel as a public figure as well as a statesman, and was essentially the Jewish nation's representative for spiritual matters. You should know, actually, in terms of his time in Salonika, we actually have a number of the Divrei Torah he delivered to the Salonika community, including the last one that he gave. In a collection of sermons that are actually, it's in the back of a commentary on Pirkei Avot. It's a classic printing of Pirkei Avot with a Ladino translation, and in the back is a collection of his sermons, including those that he gave in Salonika. So if people are interested in that, they can track that down. So he's going to now
you should consider doing a class on that. That sounds like a wonderful series potentially.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And actually, I have a number of them that I've translated over the years. So thank you for that idea. That could be a very good one. Actually, I wonder if I have it on my shelf right here. It's possible. Right behind me. No, I'll have to get it later. Okay. So let's take a look at what he has to say, right? So we saw a very Jewish expression, right, of Immanuel Kant's idea of sovereign self, right? A very Jewish version of it, actually, which I think added a lot of important layers, representative of Jewish philosophy. But now we're going to see a totally different perspective, very much, in the vein of thinkers like Alistair MacIntyre, right, representing sort of an updated version of Aristotle. Okay, so by the way, his language is just gorgeous, by the way. I think people will enjoy just hearing the language. So Chacham Uziel tells us as follows. He says, all of human reality is one organic body, which is composed from other organisms which appear separate, families and nations. Any violation against one link, even the smallest, causes paralysis and harm to the entire familial and national organism, and violates the general form of the entire body as a result. It is from this perspective that the Torah commands and states, do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not seek vengeance or bear a grudge. The Torah of Israel, however, is not satisfied with the negative exhortation of do not hate and do not seek vengeance. Rather, it immediately fuses into, this is now on the next page, immediately fuses into excuse me, those things, a positive action-oriented command of love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, just before he gets into some sort of deeper parts here, I just want us to appreciate that what he's telling us is that to love your neighbor as yourself is rooted in this idea that all of humanity is one organic whole. The reason why we ought to love another as ourselves is because we're actually part of one organic body. And to do harm, right, to another is to actually do harm to the larger body of which we are all a part, right? This has roots in Kabbalah. This has roots actually in science, actually. But this idea that we all represent parts of a larger organism. And that is really why we have this positive command of love your neighbor as yourself. So now he's going to go on further. He says, the love towards fellow beings is not love bestowed, nor is it love towards the other. Rather, it is the unification of the lover and the beloved, just as it was taught by Rabbi Joseph Alabo, right, great Jewish philosopher of the medieval period. Right, this is what the Torah stated: love your neighbor as yourself, meaning just as your love of yourself contains no otherness. When you love yourself, it's not because it's like some other that you bestow love upon. It's you realize it's because it's you. Right, he says that's actually what's being commanded of us, to see an other as part of ourselves. Right. Contains no otherness. So also your love of your fellow is not something you should consider as something other than yourself. This is the definition of complete love, that the lover and the beloved should be united. You will find this hinted at by the fact that ahava, love, has the same numeric value as echad. Right, which you gotta love the bringing in of gematria, right? Right. So ahava and the letters of ahava, right? Aleph, hey, vav, hey, right? And echad, Aleph, Het, and Dalet add up to the same amount, which is 13. For the beloved is no longer a separate other at all, right? So real love is when there's a oneness. So he continues, the commandment to love other beings is rooted in the commandment, you shall love the Lord your God. Blind egocentrism makes a person, well, before I get that, actually, just to appreciate this point, that to love God, you in order to really do that, you actually have to love others, right? It's not possible to do one without the other, he argues. So he says, blind egocentrism makes a person entirely wicked. Any Jewish person who seeks ill for their fellow, that is definition of an entirely wicked person. In contrast to this is a sense of unity, which is a source of good and blessing. When we recognize the one of the world, confirm its existence in absolute oneness, we discover that all is united through its oneness, right? God is the oneness that runs through all things, right? And when we discover that and we affirm its existence, right, we allow that unity to really be experienced. We arrive at the acknowledgement that it is only through our unity with all others that we acquire the merit for our own existence and actualize our form as a single part connected to the reason of all reasons and the cause of all causes through the love of God. So we want to talk about a narrative self, right? That this idea that we as individuals derive a value and meaning from the larger part of which we are a whole. It's precisely what he's saying here. And that larger whole, right, is actually a presence of God. He then concludes here, we will come to love ourselves and all others, for they are made in the same image and likeness. And then he concludes with explaining a very famous rabbinic passage. He says, Rabbi Akiva said, love your neighbor as yourself. It is the great principle of the Torah, right? This is a song many of us learn, right? Right, to love your neighbor as yourself. This is a great principle of the Torah. And Ben Azai said, the book of the genealogy of humankind is even greater, right? Because it shows that we have a common source. So Rabbi Uziel makes a very beautiful move here. He says, in my humble opinion, these two sages are not disagreeing at all. Rather, Rabbi Akiva is describing the effect, which is the act of loving, which he argues is the great principle as it brings about the perfection of humanity in all its paths. Meanwhile, Ben Azai is speaking about the cause of that love, which is recognizing the book of genealogy of humankind, meaning that humanity as a whole is of one genealogy. In the likeness of God did he make him, right? Humanity. And in humanity's particular and general existence is the general form of the world brought to completion. Okay. All right, so we'll just pause here for a second. Anything surprising, right, or really stand out to people that they would like to take note of? And I'm just going to give people a minute to think about it, and then I'll ask again if there's any thoughts people want to share.
I just find it the teshuvah itself is just very powerful. I especially appreciate, I find consistently in Sephardic writings, particularly among certain chachamim like Rab Uziel, that their language is really beautiful and it's very poetic in how it's written. And it's also, in a sense, a very humbling, because he writes, in my humble opinion, he kind of lowers himself in the eyes, like saying, like, you don't have to take my word for it. This is just my one perspective. Don't see me as such a great chacham. See me as just a guy who has an idea.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it is characteristic. And, I think, part of this language is Rav Uziel, amongst others, by the way, really did feel that with the emergence of Medinat Yisrael, right, with the modern nation state of Israel, this was the opportunity to actually bring a prophetic vision, right, that's described in Tanakh, right, this prophetic vision of what the world could be. This was the opportunity to do it because we had the country again in order to be able to, on a national level, right, live out these values. That was a very central thing to their belief. And so what you see is like language that like sounds very prophetic, right? In terms of its poetic phrasing and its idealism, and you really see them tapping into that prophetic spirit. Would anybody else like to comment?
I would. Can I talk?
Please.
Okay, so I was a teacher I retired after 30 years, and my last school was a international baccalaureate school. It's the IB program. I don't know if people are familiar. And one of the, we have 6 units that we study every year in every grade, and one of the units is called Share the Planet. And this ties in so well that, we are one people on this one planet, and we all have to take care of each other, take care of the planet. This, the idea of echad, of this oneness, that we all belong to this. I think it's a very, it just reminded me of what we did with the IB program. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that even the word universe comes from the word uno. So, either way,
I never thought about that.
Right. So whatever,
that's amazing.
Whatever angle we're taking it, whether it's a Jewish one or an educational one, either way, we all come down to the same concept here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that sounds inspiring to be able to work on a program like that. So we're kind of, we're in this interesting seat right now, right? Where we have Jewish thinkers that are somehow able to, or within our corpus of thinkers, we're able to sort of hold on to, which again, in Western philosophy is a total clash, right? It's like somehow, these are things that are in a dichotomy, right? It's either one or the other. Whereas what we're seeing in the corpus of Jewish literature, people really saying both and trying to hold on to both, right? As we saw in the case of Rabbi Papo, right, representing that sovereign self, but in a uniquely Jewish way, and also Rabbi Uziel really representing this narrative communal self, with these beautiful tones of prophetic understanding of the world and a deeply religious and philosophical understanding about how we're all connected. And so the last thinker that we're going to look at is Rabbi Elijah Ben Amozeg, who I'm going to read his bio in just a little bit. And he's one of the people that really tries to state explicitly how it might work that we can hold on to both of these things. And I will offer my interpretation of his words, but the truth is that I think you can read him a couple of different ways. And so I want to offer that to people to really kind of hear how I've understood Rabbi Ben Amozeg, but also to think about what are some different ways of understanding him in terms of how he is saying Judaism manages to hold on to these two notions of the self, right? One very much rooted in a sense of individual right and sovereign self versus communal responsibility and narrative self. So before we read his words, I'll just share a bit about Rabbi Ben Amozeg. He was from Livorno, Italy, although his family was Moroccan originally, and then they came to Italy. I actually had the chance to, part of my family also was from Livorno, and I had the chance to meet a Moroccan Livornese family a couple of years ago as a student of mine, and they were very, very familiar with Ben Amozeg. It was like a national treasure to them. So let me just read a little bit about him for you. Just a moment to pull my notes up. Okay, so Rabbi Ben Amozeg was born in 1823 in Livorno, Italy. The Ben Amozeg family, as I mentioned, came from Morocco, specifically the city of Fez. Rabbi Ben Amozeg's father passed away when he was just a baby, and his mother died in 1827 when he was only 4 years old. Chacham Ben Amozeg was raised by his mother's brother, Chacham Yehuda Koriat, with whom he also studied Torah. While studying Bible, Talmud, Midrash, and Kabbalah, he expanded the scope of his studies to include secular studies and languages. In 1839, at the age of 16, he wrote the introduction to the Ma'or Vashemesh commentary written by his uncle. While in his 20s, he began to work as a darshan. He was subsequently appointed to the position of dayan and taught in the city's rabbinic seminary. Chacham Ben Amozeg set up a printing press in Livorno. I actually own one of the books printed by his printing press. There was a very famous set of a chumash, basically, but in 5 distinct volumes called the Or Gadol. And one edition was printed by his printing press. I own one volume of it from the mid 1800s. So it's kind of a cool thing. And so he had that printing press, which is a very important one in that city, where he printed Jewish prayer books and study books, many of which were authored by Moroccan sages. His own books were also printed in the publishing house he established. Chacham Ben Amozeg confronted secular knowledge with Torah wisdom and sought to reveal the Torah's inherent truth in this way. According to him, all human knowledge contains sparks of the truth revealed to the people of Israel in the Torah. He did not hesitate in applying science to his understanding of the Torah, something was very considered suspect by other sages of his time. He wrote a very famous defense of his approach. He wrote a commentary called Aim Lamikra, which actually earned him a ban, and his books were banned and burned in certain communities. So he wrote a very famous defense of his approach. And that was in 1865 that after his publishing of Aim Lamikra, that he wrote this famous defense of his approach. There were sages that burned his books. There were others that didn't burn it, but didn't want to accept it either. So he was kind of a controversial figure, but really sort of much a forerunner, and to many of us actually, really embodies sort of the classical Sephardic spirit of embracing secular knowledge and having it inform and help us in our understanding of Torah topics as well. So from Rabbi Ben Moseg. So I don't have the Hebrew here, in part because he did not write this in Hebrew. He wrote it in French. And so this is not my French translation. I speak abysmal French, but this is a translation that exists, and you can buy his work. This is from Israel Humanité, right? Israel and Humanity. And he refers to Judaism actually in an interesting way. He refers to it as Hebraism. And in this section, he's really going to try to show us how Hebraism, right, or Judaism, is able to hold on to these two notions of self, one very sovereign self, self-oriented, one very communal self, narrative, communal-oriented. So let's see what he has to say. So he says, Jewish ethics is the coupling of justice and mercy. Each one fulfills the other, and each works together to guide the larger human family. The main body of one is the written Torah, the Torah shebichtav, while the second is represented by the oral Torah, the Torah shebe'al peh. We go to the next page now. Thanks, Ethan. One body faces society and manages all of its needs, while the second dwells in the very essence of individual conscience. In this way, Hebraism embraces the whole person, body and soul, the life of this world, which is responsible to Jewish law, and the life of the world to come, which is dependent upon tradition, which is the codex of conscience, individual conscience, he says earlier. From our perspective, Hebraism is at once both justice and mercy, the Torah of ethics as well as the state, the Torah of Moses and the tradition of Israel. From one side, Hebraism is a religion that is in the place for the functioning of the nation, right, of the community, a collective existence whose entire being is in this world. And from this, Hebraism derives its appearance of worldliness. But from the other side, it is the codex that guides the conscience, which again referred to as the individual conscience earlier. It is the source of doctrines, principles, and hopes tied to the soul of humanity. And from this, Hebraism derives its appearance of asceticism, like a retreat from the world. The unification of these two aspects, that is Hebraism. And I'll just offer sort of, again, my understanding of his words as I've read them throughout the years. But I do, again, want to hold out there for people to certainly consider other ways of understanding of what he's writing. In essence, what he's saying is that my obligations do not only come from what I choose as an individual, although some of it certainly does. My obligations also come from the Torah and the needs of the functioning of the nation or the community. On the other hand, our tradition shapes our individual conscience, and I cannot act in any way that would violate that individual conscience. And so, I think he's saying, we walk the razor's edge, kept sharp by the healthy tension between what the community demands of me and what my individual conscience permits me. The goal is not either or, but in true Jewish fashion, to have a generative dialogue. It's as if, I think he's arguing, we should have an internal Shammai and Hillel, ensuring a pursuit l'shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven, our highest ideals, to be able to hold in tension my obligations as a narrative communal member, and at the same time to live in harmony and consistency to the voice of my own personal conscience. So those are my closing words. I want to open up if anybody has any remaining thoughts at our last minute.
I have two.
Please.
So I guess the more important is kind of just saying that I really enjoyed this, and I wondered if you could recommend anything similar in the future, like do you teach any other classes via Zoom or?
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I thank you for being here and participating in these sessions. So Ethan and I are have some things in the works to do classes on Zoom here coming up, and so please keep your eye open for those. We have a I think, a couple of ideas that we're working on. I will also share with Ethan classes that I teach in other venues as well, which I do sometimes for the Sephardic Educational Center, or sometimes just community education. And so I'll let Ethan know about those, and he can share that with a broader community.
Well, I have the thought.
Please share. Saul, are you able to get through? Okay, it seems like maybe there's a mic problem. Or...
Hello.
Okay.
Okay, so I think for the non-spiritual people, even though I don't know if they, adhere to the principle that we're all children of God, we need a commandment that would encompass the secular people, the atheists, whatever. And instead of having a commandment, love your fellow man as you love God, etc., maybe we should have something to the effect stating what you hate done to you, you should not do to others. And that may be a little more effective, I don't know. But the way it's written in the Torah, it's not working too well from all our observations and Hitler's and, the whole 9 yards there. So maybe we need something a little more forceful, something that they could understand better.
That, I really appreciate your raising that. We've got a long way to go, right? To really, to reach these ideals. And something that you raised that makes me think, about this negative, not meaning bad, but like the don't do version, right? Of that which is hateful to you, don't do to others, right? Which is what Hillel, right, famously tells, a person coming to inquire about Judaism. I think what you're saying, really highlights why he may have given that answer. In other words, why not just say, love your neighbor as yourself? And I think, what you're offering, at least as I hear it, is because it's like that at least is a good first step, right? If we can actually just get people to not do harmful things to people, right? It's like that would be a huge, right, leap forward. And then, we can start to talk about loving, right? Actually loving our neighbors as ourselves. So thank you for sharing that thought. I think there's a lot of insight in
yeah, Neil, because if you read psychological studies, there are a lot of people that don't love themselves. So how can they love anybody else if they don't love themselves first? So I'm thinking you got to hit them with a sledgehammer or something. Something that you hate done to you, do not do to others. Has nothing to do with religion, whatever religion, because every religion preaches peace and love your fellow man. But what do you do for the rest of the world, the secular world, the atheists, whatever?
Right. Yeah. No,
the thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is something kind of like intuitive, right? We know, so we're sort of, or in some ways more ready to access like what we don't want done to us, right? We somehow like that is an easier place to get to. And so then to think about, okay, and then how can I extend that, right? To making sure I don't do that to other people, I think is a really great point.
Thank you very much.
Says almost exactly that in one of her novels.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said that Dara Horn says almost exactly that in one of her novels. I think it was Eternal Life.
She's great, by the way. She's a phenomenal writer. Yeah.
Yes.
So which book of hers was it? I want to write that down.
I think it's Eternal Life.
Okay, check that out.
It's the one about the woman who never dies. So she was born, she's an ancient Israelite and just like lived lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. So she was around when Hillel first spoke those words.
Right. I've only read one book of hers. I'm trying to remember which one it was. The World to Come. That was, The World to Come. No. It was years and years and years ago, though, when that first came out, which I think was like, it's got to be more than 10 years ago. But so I will have to check that out, the Eternal Life. So you're saying she makes a similar point.
Yeah. When she has the event of like, oh, Hillel said this, and in the negative, as Saul mentioned, And they talk about how, not everybody enjoys the same things. So doing what you want done to you might not actually be good for someone else, but not doing that which is hateful to you is a bit more universal.
So there's this really great discussion, and in some ways, like only philosophers could have this discussion, right? They say, well, really, it should be love your neighbor as they love themselves, right? Because for this point that you're making, and so that has in some circles been called the platinum rule, right? If the golden rule is to love your neighbor as yourself, the platinum rule is to love your neighbor as themselves. But then detractors say, but no, but that is what you would want somebody to do for you. So it is loving your neighbor as yourself. So that kind of becomes like this circle. But it does speak to, I think, that there are nuances and subtleties to this that make it challenging. But sort of the commitment to it, right? In some ways is the key piece, right? If we can at least commit to trying to do that, right? If we could even all get that far, right, that would be pretty extraordinary. So what I'm going to do is, as I mentioned, I'm going to add that source to the document about the story with Rabbi Papo so people can see it. And people should feel free. Again, they have access to this document. You can make a copy of it. You can download it. And I hope that these are sources that people have occasion to revisit and to think about. I just want to thank everybody for going on this journey together. And I look forward to our next opportunity to learn together in community. So thank you all so much.
Could you share the link to the document in the chat?
Or can you email it, Ethan? Maybe can you email the Google link?
Absolutely.
So let me do both for those that can access it now in the chat. The link is going in right now, and then yes, Ethan has a PDF version of it. So Ethan, thank you for being willing to send that out.
Thank you so much. This was really nice.
Thank you all so much. I look forward to the next time.
Hazak Baruch, Rabbi, and thank you all for joining us. Inshallah, for another class in the future very soon.
Inshallah.
Thank you,
Everyone
Marcus.
have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.